Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk, Hinson Amendment Number 1, and I ask it be considered as read.
Okay, the gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My colleagues, this amendment would prohibit any funding in this bill from administering, supporting, or enforcing the February 18th, 2021 interim guidance memo from ICE on civil immigration enforcement and removal priorities. So this memo and the guidance that is set out in it, I believe, have ultimately made our country less safe, Iowans and Americans less safe. As a result of this memo specifically, removals of criminals within our borders have plummeted. This guidance sets out stringent and too narrow of guidance for removals, tying the hands of ICE agents who are working every day to keep our communities safe. According to this guidance specifically, an illegal immigrant is only considered an enforcement priority and pre-approved for removal when the person is a threat to national security, border security, or public safety. But the problem is really with how these categories are so narrowly defined. An illegal immigrant is only eligible for enforcement under the public safety category when he or she is considered to pose a threat to public safety and when he or she have been convicted of an aggravated felony. So basically this means a convicted criminal who should be considered a threat to public safety would get to stay here if that crime was not an aggravated felony. And the real kicker is that agents are also supposed to consider mitigating factors, including personal and family circumstances, health and medical factors, when considering whether an illegal immigrant is considered a threat to public safety, even when they've been convicted of this aggravated felony. So right now, this means that there are possibly illegal immigrants in our country that ICE is aware of and considers a threat to public safety, but who agents cannot remove because they're not convicted of this aggravated felony, or the other way around. Aggravated felons who they don't consider threats to public safety because of quote-unquote mitigating factors. So in my opinion, we are jeopardizing the safety and security of Americans by allowing an aggravated felon who is here illegally to not be considered a threat to public safety because of personal circumstances. Members of Congress have sought answers on these mitigating factors that have prevented aggravated felons from being considered a threat to public safety, but to no avail at this point. My request for information, the answers to these questions, data from ICE, this information has gone unanswered. We expect to get that information, and again, we do not have it. The results of this memo from February 18th are very real, and the administration was aware of the drastic reduction in arrests and deportations that would happen as a result of these policies. ICE officials themselves predicted a 50% reduction in these arrests. CBP encounters at the southwest border are at record high levels, while ICE made only 2,837 arrests and deportations record lows. Deportations dipped below 3,000 for the first time ever in April, and yet the influx, the incredible surge of illegal immigration at our southern border continues. That's flat out unacceptable, and again, this is a safety and security issue for Iowa families and American families. The ICE acting director, his memo cites limited resources as the justification for lowering enforcement. The agency needs more funds to conduct their mission, and they have made that very clear to us, both on the subcommittee and as members of this committee. Yet here we are with a bill that guts the funding to ICE, slashing custody operations by more than $375 million, and remaking enforcement and removal operations as civil immigration enforcement operations, which is really, sounds like bureaucratic jargon. Instead of having our ICE agents actually do their job, it more implies that they should be turning their blind eye to these cases. We've heard for calls of abolition for ICE, and this has really been happening piece by piece. First, it seems the Biden administration is tying the hands of its agents with this February memo and, again, slowly defunding the agency's ability to do its job. So this February 18th memo does that. It prevents our ICE agents from doing their job effectively and enforcing these laws with dangerous criminals. So I would ask you all, please join me in supporting this amendment and ending the implementation of this guidance, returning to what it was before February 18th. To protect taxpayers and our communities. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Ms. Roybal-Allard.
I rise in a strong opposition to this amendment. For too long, we have been operating under the mistaken belief that in order to ensure a secure border, we must indefinitely imprison asylum seekers in inhumane jail-like settings, often for months, sometimes even for years, while they wait for their immigration cases to work through an extremely backlogged immigration court system. We have a moral obligation to do better, and I believe that we can. The bill currently strikes a strong balance between providing the necessary detention capacity needed to facilitate migrant processing and ensure our communities are safe, while also recognizing that the preponderance of asylum seekers pose no threat to public safety or national security. ICE's current immigration enforcement and removal priorities guidance is a small step towards recognizing that compliance with immigration proceedings can be done in a more humane, less costly manner through alternatives to detention or other forms of release, unless there is evidence to suggest that someone poses a danger or flight risk. We need to be doing even more to protect asylum seekers, and we need to stop the kind of irresponsible rhetoric and false claims of harm caused by asylum seekers, and we need to focus on immigration reform. We need to rebuild trust with our communities, and I urge opposition to the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the gentlelady for offering this amendment, and I rise in strong support of it. I yield back.
Are there any other members wishing to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Gonzalez.
So I rise in support of this amendment, and we've heard earlier that this committee is defunding Border Patrol by over $1 million, and they're also defunding ICE by millions of dollars. In the same breath, we are also cutting what the ability ICE can do to enforce our laws, and too often the issue gets muddied. Asylum seekers get put together with criminals. That's not the case. There's absolutely folks that have fled their homeland in support of a better life. In the same breath, there's absolutely folks that have entered our country illegally that are nefarious actors. I have visited all types of facilities, from unaccompanied minor facilities to families to criminals, where immigrants that have a criminal record are being held. And now is not the time, during one of the largest border crises that this country has ever seen, now is not the time to make laws so narrow that ICE can't even enforce them. This isn't about enforcing against asylum seekers. This is about enforcing and protecting our border communities against actual criminals that are in everyday society. That's what this is about, not undermining the asylum seeking process. And I urge support for this amendment.
Any other members wish to be heard? Hearing none, the gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do appreciate my colleagues' input on this, and I do think we should be working together to reform our legal immigration system. It's an important issue. We've heard a lot of discussion about that, and there is substantial need for reform, and I look forward to working together wherever we can on this very important issue. But this is one spot where I really believe Congress has a fundamental goal and mission in doing our job to keep Americans safe and secure from harm. So I'd again encourage all my colleagues to read this memo. It is just too narrow, and its enforcement is too narrow. And I believe because of that, it puts Americans' lives in danger, and it ties the hands of the agents who are working every day to keep our country safe. So let's let those ICE agents do their jobs, the jobs that they signed up for to protect our country, and I would encourage all of my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Iowa. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. 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 In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted. Further amendments? Ms. Hinson is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have another amendment at the desk, Hinson Amendment Number 2, and I ask the reading be dispensed with.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This amendment will strike the section of the bill that permits the transfer of $100 million in previous border security funds to the Department of the Interior from Customs and Border Protection's budget. These are the funds that Congress had previously appropriated to secure our southwest border. And now more than ever, based on the discussion we've had today, we need to make sure that money is going to keep American families safe. We have talked about how this crisis at the border is both a humanitarian crisis and a national security crisis, and we must consider both of those aspects in our decision-making. This bill does address many of the humanitarian needs. It pours tens of millions of dollars into items like migrant processing improvements, and funding child caregivers, all very important things. But it does fall severely short when it comes to the efforts to respond to the security aspects of this surge and crisis at the border. We have seen a substantial surge at our southwest border, the highest numbers we've seen in decades. In May alone, more than 180,000 encounters, 180,000, and CBP is stretched thin. While this bill today cuts our funding to CBP by more than $900 million with no new money for border agents, tucked away in Section 211 is a provision that transfers $100 million in funds that were previously enacted for border security. So where's this money going when it's ripped from CBP's anemic budget? It is instead going to plants that have been trampled by illegal immigrants. It's certainly not being used as I believe it was intended to be used, which is to secure our border. And I know many of the members of this committee, including myself, have been to the border to see what's happening. And I think as appropriators, it is really important that we go and see what we're spending our taxpayer dollars on. I traveled with Representative Gonzalez to the Del Rio sector in Texas, spoke with agents from CBP on the ground, and I have been following their reports. I would encourage all of my colleagues to look at the Del Rio sector's Facebook page. They post these statistics pretty much on a daily basis. But here are some of the most recent ones that I pulled from their Facebook page. From July 2nd to 5th, Border Patrol agents arrested 3 Mexican nationals with prior convictions for child molestation, sexual abuse, and aggravated criminal sexual abuse. On the 4th of July, Border Patrol agents arrested a Mexican national with a prior conviction of second-degree attempted murder in California in 2009. After 5 years in prison, he was deported back to Mexico in 2014, but again, reapprehended trying to cross our border. And since the start of fiscal year 21, agents have arrested 927 undocumented migrants with prior criminal convictions, a 382% increase over the same time frame last fiscal year. And these are just the people that have been caught. There are others who slip by into the Homeland and into our communities, into Iowa, into every state, which is a border state. So beyond the criminals and human traffickers, let's talk about the fentanyl and all of the other drugs as well. The DEA and CBP have tracked fentanyl pouring across our southern border, directly sourced from China. In the month of May alone, CBP seized over 950 pounds of fentanyl. That's enough to kill over 200,000 Americans. Ladies and gentlemen, our southern border is open for business, and the cartels are a hungry customer walking through our doors. So this money is needed for border security. This money is needed for that enforcement. We need to secure our borders. We need to protect Americans. That's our job. Border security is a key aspect of immigration policy that this bill neglects. And when our borders are open, again, every state becomes a border state. So I urge you to support this amendment to, again, give our men and women on the borderline the resources that they need to protect our communities, keep our country safe. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Ms. Rival-Allard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in strong opposition to this amendment, but before I do, I do want to point out something with regards to what has been said about the funding for Border Patrol, and that is to point out that for border and security operations, we have actually increased the amount that we have provided for them by almost $332 million. Now, my reason for opposing this amendment are many, but first I would hope that no member would question the fact that the construction of border infrastructure has harmful effects on the ecology of the surrounding areas. This is particularly true for federal lands that host threatened flora and fauna, serve as critical wildlife mitigation corridors, or provide critical wildlife access to drinking water. I think this amendment is more about the basic disagreement about the costs and benefits of border barriers. They are effective in some places, but not well justified in many others. In every case, we must weigh both the benefits and the costs, which include not just the expense of those barriers, which can range upward of $300 million per mile, but also the impact on communities and the environment. The amendment seeks to strike language in the bill authorizing the Homeland Security Department to transfer funds to the Interior Department agencies to mitigate the impacts of border barrier construction on federal lands, including through land acquisition. Some of my colleagues have suggested that the rescission of prior year border barrier funding in the fiscal year 2022 Homeland funding bill, and in this case, the repurposing of prior year border barrier funding for environmental mitigation is somehow a violation of agreements made to enact those prior year bills. I would remind my friends on the other side of the aisle who might want to support this amendment that prior Congresses cannot bind the actions of the current Congress. But even more to the point, as I have noted before, the last administration flagrantly violated those prior year agreements almost immediately after they were made, when it diverted nearly $10 billion from the Department of Defense for border barrier construction. The language this amendment seeks to strike is itself a mitigation of that prior administration violation of agreements made by those Congresses in good faith, only to have them thrown back to our face. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of the gentlelady's amendment and urge a yes vote. I yield back my time.
Any other members wishing to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, the gentlewoman is recognized to close for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do appreciate the passion surrounding this issue on both sides of the aisle. But if you look at the reports, you see what's happening on the border firsthand. It is heartbreaking. I saw it firsthand, as I've mentioned before, and thinking about the kids that are there and what's happening. I know it's an issue that we need to address. I know this bill does address some of these issues, but we have to address the crisis. And in my mind, part of addressing the crisis is making sure that we have a safe and secure border. I think the ultimate goal here is we need to focus on the safety and security for Iowa and American families, and pushing back against the cartels, empowering our agents to do their jobs is the way we do that. The way we don't do that is by transferring funds out of CBP's budget. So I would ask for support for this amendment, because I think, again, this is about safety and security for American families and helping to end the crisis at our border. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Let me recognize the chair of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just realized that I misspoke, and I said that the expense of some of the barriers was upwards of $300 million per mile. It is actually $30 million dollars per mile.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Iowa. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. And the
Madam Chair,
amendment is
I ask for a roll call vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Please raise your hand. A sufficient number being in support. Recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar votes no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Bishop.
Aye.
Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mrs. Bustos. Mrs. Bustos votes no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Case. Mr. Case votes no. Ms. Clark.
No.
Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Klein.
Aye.
Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole votes aye. Mr. Christ.
No.
Mr. Christ votes no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar votes no. Ms. DeLauro?
No.
Ms. DeLauro votes no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart votes aye. Mr. Espaillat?
Hey,
Mr. Espaillat votes no. Mr.
it's
Fleischman?
I should have voted no.
Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fleischman votes aye. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry votes aye. Ms. Frankel?
No.
Ms. Frankel votes no. Mr. Garcia?
Aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez?
Aye.
Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Ms. Granger?
Aye.
Ms. Granger votes aye. Mr. Harder? No. Mr. Harder votes no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris votes aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler votes aye. Mrs. Hinson? Mrs. Hinson votes aye. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce votes aye. Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter votes no. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer votes no. Mrs. Kirkpatrick?
No.
Mrs. Kirkpatrick votes no. Mrs. Lawrence? Mrs. Lawrence votes no. Ms. Lee of California? Ms. Lee of California votes no. Mrs. Lee of Nevada? Mrs. Lee of Nevada votes no. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum votes no. Ms. Meng?
No.
Ms. Meng votes no. Mr. Molinar?
Aye.
Mr. Molinar votes aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo votes aye. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree votes no. Mr. Pocan? Mr. Pocan votes no. Mr. Price? Mr. Price votes no. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers votes aye. Ms. Roybal-Allard? Ms. Roybal-Allard votes no. Mr. Ruppersberger? Mr. Ruppersberger votes no. Mr. Rutherford?
Aye.
Mr. Rutherford votes aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson votes aye. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart votes aye. Mrs. Torres?
No.
Mrs. Torres votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo votes aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mrs. Watson Coleman?
No.
Mrs. Watson Coleman votes no. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton votes no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack votes aye.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote?
Madam Chairman, how am I recorded?
You are voted as aye, Mr. Bishop.
My vote should be no.
Okay, thank
Mr.
you.
Bishop votes no.
Mr. Cartwright?
How am I recorded?
You are not recorded, Mr. Cartwright.
I vote no.
Mr. Cartwright votes no.
Any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? Okay. The clerk will tally.
I thought I liked the gold. Sucker. Nothing compared to these guys.
On this vote, the yeas are 23 and the nays are 33. The amendment is not adopted. Is there any further amendment or discussion? Seeing none, I recognize the gentlewoman from Ohio for a motion. I ask for your support of this bill.
Madam Chairwoman, I move to favorably report the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act 2022 to the House.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
That was good. Thank
Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Sufficient number being in support. Recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? Mr. Aguilar? Mr. Aguilar votes aye. Mr. Amadei? Mr. Bishop?
Aye.
Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mrs. Bustos? Mrs. Bustos votes aye. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Calvert votes no. Mr. Carter?
But I voted it no.
Mr. Carter?
Or we didn't. Well,
I lost it. I'll come back. Mr. Cartwright? Mr. Cartwright votes aye. Mr. Case? Mr. Case votes aye. Ms. Clark?
Aye.
Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Klein?
No.
Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole votes no. Mr. Christ?
Aye.
Mr. Christ votes aye. Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Cuellar votes aye. Ms. DeLauro?
Aye.
Ms. DeLauro votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart votes no. Mr. Espaillat?
Aye.
Mr. Espaillat votes aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman votes no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry votes no. Ms. Frankel?
Aye.
Ms. Frankel votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
No.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Ms. Granger?
No.
Ms. Granger votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes aye. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris votes no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler votes no. Mrs. Hinson? Mrs. Hinson votes no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce votes no. Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter votes aye. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer votes aye. Mrs. Kirkpatrick?
Aye.
Mrs. Kirkpatrick votes aye. Mrs. Lawrence? Mrs. Lawrence votes aye. Ms. Lee of California? Ms. Lee of California votes aye. Mrs. Lee of Nevada? Mrs. Lee of Nevada votes aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum votes aye. Ms. Meng?
Aye.
Ms. Meng votes aye. Mr. Molinar? Mr. Molinar votes no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse votes no. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo votes no. Ms. Pingree?
Aye.
Ms. Pingree votes aye. Mr. Pocan? Mr. Pocan votes aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price votes aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley votes aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers votes no. Ms. Roybal-Allard? Ms. Roybal-Allard votes aye. Mr. Ruppersberger? Mr. Ruppersberger votes aye. Mr. Rutherford?
No.
Mr. Rutherford votes no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan votes aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson votes no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart votes no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres votes aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes aye. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo votes no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mrs. Watson Coleman?
Aye.
Mrs. Watson Coleman votes aye. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton votes aye. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack votes no.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? Mr. Carter? Judge Carter?
That's Texas, that's a Texas legislature,
Judge Carter?
except there's a third part. Yeah. Did they say that in California? Yeah.
Judge Carter?
Judge Carter, wake up.
Is there any way we can reach Judge Carter?
Yes, sir.
I can't see that far, so it's. He has technical problems. Can somebody? It's got it, yeah.
He did give a thumbs down.
So can I, but there's some, requirements around this process, Mr. Simpson. I think I could take a tally of the entire.
Kim, I think you're doing,
Can he call us? It has to be audible. Put him on speaker, then.
I know, but he has to hear him.
The issue is it has to be audible. That is what the requirements are. We're trying to do everything we can so that the Judge Carter can cast his vote. Can we put it on speaker so we can hear? Okay. That's- He has to call through the WebEx number so we can,
Crazy.
there is a WebEx number specifically for this point. That's sometimes one of the reasons why we want to be here in person.
Exactly.
No one's vote should be not. Okay. We don't want to hear from you on this one, Mr. Cuellar. Judge Carter?
Go for it.
What's happening?
As long as you're not a reporter.
Where is it? I think it would be a good. Celia, in a moment you can go get something to eat. What's happening?
I just remember he started coughing and then he said he muted. How long ago did he start coughing?
Thanks for lunch, Emily. Very good.
Madam Chairman,
He's back now. Judge Carter.
this is John Carter. I'm recording.
Not recorded.
You're not recorded, Judge.
Record me as a no, please.
Okay, thank you, Judge Carter.
Mr. Carter votes no.
Thank you. Here's that, I'm cheering for a no
Computer
vote here.
problems.
Okay.
Okay, we'll see you later.
It's good to hear your voice, Judge Carter. Okay, the clerk
Yeah.
will tally.
Okay, thank you.
You can go. It's momentarily.
We should be doing markups in the winter time.
We are, it feels like.
So at least we're dressed appropriately in
Yeah,
boots
that's
and
right.
wool.
Yeah, then we can actually dress better.
On this vote, the yeas are 33, the nays are 24. The motion is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that staff be permitted to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and report, and the report just approved. Seeing no objection, so ordered.
3 days.
Okay,
Thank you, Madam Chair.
thank you.